The war had been lost before it truly began. We understood this now, standing in the ruins of what had once been the Galactic Council's most fortified command station, watching through shattered viewports as the dissolution fleets carved through our final defensive line like a predator through prey. They were methodical, these ancient machines, executing a genocide with the precision of a surgical instrument. 17 civilizations had already fallen to their inexorable advance, each one catalogued and archived before being systematically erased from existence. We were to be the 18th, and there would be no 19th because we were the last. The younger races had been consumed first, then the elder species, and now only we of the Council remained, huddled in our failing fortress, counting the hours until oblivion claimed us all. I was Communications Director Velshera of the Anthari Collective, though titles meant little now when there was no collective left to direct. My 3 primary appendages trembled as I monitored the quantum channels, watching system after system go dark. Each silence represented billions of lives, entire cultures, millennia of accumulated wisdom, gone in the span of a heartbeat. The dissolution did not conquer or subjugate. They simply erased, converting matter and energy into something we could not comprehend, leaving behind voids in space where worlds had once turned. Our greatest scientists had tried to understand their purpose, their origin, their weakness. They had found nothing. These beings, if beings they were, operated on principles that defied our understanding of reality itself. They could not be reasoned with, could not be fought, could not be stopped. High Commander Thexiol of the Vorten Ascendancy stood beside me, his crystalline form dimmed to a dull gray, the color of resignation. He had led the combined fleets in 43 separate engagements. He had lost 43 separate engagements. Not through incompetence or cowardice, but because victory was simply not possible. The dissolution absorbed our weapons' fire, adapted to our tactics in real time, and retaliated with forces that multiplied exponentially. For every ship we destroyed, if indeed we destroyed any, 3 more would emerge from the corpse of the first. The mathematician Cast had calculated the probabilities weeks ago. Even if every remaining ship in the galaxy formed a unified front, even if we sacrificed every inhabited world to build weapons of unimaginable power, we would delay the inevitable by perhaps 6 standard cycles. 6 cycles to watch our civilization die slowly instead of quickly. The Council Chamber had once held representatives from 47 species, a grand hall designed to showcase the diversity and strength of our alliance. Now, only 7 of us remained, the last survivors of our respective peoples, and the hall felt obscenely vast and empty. We had tried everything. Diplomatic overtures had been ignored. Tactical retreats had merely extended our suffering. Desperate gambles with experimental weapons had yielded nothing but ash and disappointment. We had even attempted to flee, to load colony ships with the remnants of our populations and run to the dark spaces between galaxies. The dissolution had followed, patient and relentless, destroying each ship with the same mechanical efficiency they brought to everything else. There was no escape, no sanctuary, no hope. It was Elder Counselor Miraveth who first suggested the unthinkable. She was of the Lumini, an ancient species that had been spacefaring when my people still crawled in tidal pools, and her kind had accumulated more forbidden knowledge than any other civilization in the known galaxy. She accessed the deepest archives, the sealed records that carried warnings in 17 dead languages, and she found a reference that made even her eternal composure crack. There existed, she told us in a voice that carried the weight of terrible certainty, one more option. One final, desperate gambit. There was a species, she said, that the first civilization had encountered and deemed too dangerous to contact, too volatile to uplift, too destructive to allow into the galactic community. A species so inherently violent, so instinctively aggressive, that the ancients had placed a quarantine beacon around their entire star system with instructions in the root language of civilization itself that translated simply to a single word repeated forever: stay away. The chamber fell silent as she displayed the coordinates. The species had been monitored from a distance for epochs, studied as one might study a particularly virulent plague, always with the knowledge that direct contact was forbidden under penalty of complete societal ostracism. They were young, having only recently achieved spaceflight, and they had spent the entirety of their recorded history engaged in warfare with themselves. Their homeworld bore the scars of countless conflicts, their literature was filled with tales of violence and conquest, and their rapid technological advancement seemed driven primarily by the desire to develop more efficient methods of destroying one another. The ancients had determined that if such a species were ever unified and given access to galactic civilization, they would become a threat greater than any the galaxy had faced. They were builders of weapons, lovers of battle, survivors of impossible odds, and their defining characteristic was a stubborn refusal to accept defeat even when defeat was the only rational outcome. They called themselves humanity, and we were about to break 10,000 years of quarantine to ask them for help. High Commander Thexiel vocalized what we were all thinking. He noted that inviting such a species to fight alongside us might simply be trading one destroyer for another, that we might survive the dissolution only to face enslavement or extinction at the hands of these humans. Elder Counselor Miraveth met his objection with a question that cut through our despair like a blade. She asked him, quite simply, if we had any alternative that offered even the smallest probability of survival. The silence that followed was answer enough. We did not. We had exhausted every option, explored every possibility, and now stood at the precipice of total annihilation with nothing left to lose. If humanity proved as dangerous as the ancients believed, then at least we would die knowing we had tried everything, fought to our last breath, refused to surrender quietly to the darkness. I was given the task because my species possessed vocal apparatus most similar to the human's auditory range, and because someone had to do it and I was too tired to refuse. I crafted the message carefully, knowing it might be the last transmission any council species ever sent. I explained our situation with brutal honesty, holding nothing back about the scale of our losses or the completeness of our defeat. I told them about the dissolution, about the 17 dead civilizations, about our failed attempts at resistance. I provided coordinates to our location and tactical data on our enemy, though I doubted it would help. And then I made the request that would either save us or doom us, the words feeling like a betrayal of every principle the galactic community had held sacred. I asked humanity, these dangerous children we had kept locked away for their own protection and ours, to come to our aid. I asked them to bring their weapons, their warships, their terrible capacity for violence, and to unleash it upon an enemy that had proven unstoppable by any civilized means. The transmission was sent on all frequencies, broadcast through the quantum foam to ensure it would reach their quarantine system. Then we waited, counting the minutes until the dissolution arrived to claim what remained of us, wondering if we had made a catastrophic mistake in our final hours, hoping against hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the most dangerous species in the galaxy might prove dangerous enough to face what we could not. The viewports showed the advancing fleet, a wall of darkness consuming stars as it approached. We had perhaps 3 cycles before they reached us. 3 cycles to learn if humanity would answer, and if they did, whether their answer would bring salvation or simply a different flavor of oblivion. Behind me, the other counselors prepared for the end, making peace with their gods or their philosophies or their memories. I remained at my station, monitoring the quantum channels, waiting for a response that might never come, from a species that had every reason to let us die. The response came 17 standard hours later, faster than quantum physics should have allowed, and it was not what any of us expected. Instead of a formal diplomatic reply or a military transmission, the first thing we received from humanity was laughter. Actual laughter, raw and unfiltered, echoing through our communication systems with an emotion we had not heard in months of retreating and dying. The voice that followed was young, male by their species' binary convention, and carried an accent our translation matrices struggled to process because it was layered with colloquialisms and cultural references completely alien to our databases. He identified himself as Captain Jake Morrison of the human vessel Indomitable, and he informed us with what could only be described as enthusiasm that we had made what he called one hell of a phone call to the right neighborhood. His response was so casual, so utterly lacking in the gravity our situation demanded, that for a moment I thought the transmission was some kind of elaborate hoax or that our translator had catastrophically failed. But then the sensors began registering anomalies in the quantum foam, massive distortions that indicated ships transitioning from faster-than-light travel, and they were coming from the direction of the quarantine zone. Not one ship. Not a small reconnaissance force. The scanners showed 87 distinct signatures, each one broadcasting identification codes that matched no known galactic registry because they had never been part of any galactic database. They were human vessels, and they were arriving in formation with a precision that spoke of extensive combat experience and coordination. High Commander Thexiol pulled up the tactical displays and his crystalline form flickered through several colors we had learned to associate with profound confusion. The human fleet was not behaving like any military force we had ever encountered. They were not establishing defensive positions or running reconnaissance sweeps. They were accelerating directly toward the dissolution advance fleet, their weapons already powering up, their approach vectors calculating intercept courses that would bring them into contact with the enemy in less than 2 cycles. Captain Morrison's voice came through again, and this time there was an edge to it that made my translator render the words with aggressive confidence that bordered on arrogance. He acknowledged that they had received our distress call and had reviewed the tactical data we provided on the dissolution. He admitted that it looked like a tough situation, which was perhaps the greatest understatement I had ever heard translated into my language. Then he said something that would have sounded insane if we had not been so desperate. He said that humanity had spent their entire existence preparing for exactly this kind of fight, that their species had been forged in conflict and tempered by adversity, and that they were about to demonstrate why the ancients had been so terrified of letting them off their leash. He asked us to stand by, observe, and learn what happens when you wake up a species that evolved to be the apex predator on a death world where 99% of all species that ever lived went extinct before humanity clawed its way to the top of the food chain. The human fleet split into 7 battle groups with a fluidity that suggested this was a maneuver they had practiced countless times. Each group consisted of 12 to 13 vessels of varying sizes, from massive dreadnoughts bristling with weapons we could not immediately classify to smaller, faster ships that moved with an agility our sensors struggled to track. They arranged themselves in a formation our tactical analysts could not recognize because it was not designed for defense or retreat. It was designed purely for aggression, for inflicting maximum damage while accepting maximum risk, and it required a level of coordination and trust that we had never achieved even in our most desperate battles. The dissolution fleet, perhaps registering this new factor, adjusted its approach vector to engage. There were 342 dissolution vessels bearing down on the human fleet, each one equivalent in destructive capacity to our most powerful battleships, each one crewed by intelligences or systems that had never known defeat. The tactical computer calculated the probable outcome and displayed it for the Council. Human casualties, 100%. Time to complete annihilation, 14 standard minutes. The humans attacked first, naturally. They did not wait for the dissolution to enter optimal weapons range, did not attempt to establish communication or probe for weaknesses. They simply accelerated to speeds that should have torn their vessels apart from the inertial forces and opened fire with everything they had. Their weapons were crude by our standards, relying on kinetic impactors, chemical explosives, and nuclear fission devices rather than the elegant energy-based systems galactic civilization had perfected over millennia. But what they lacked in sophistication they compensated for with overwhelming volume and shocking creativity. They launched thousands of missiles simultaneously, creating a cloud of projectiles so dense it registered on our sensors as a solid wall. The dissolution adapted immediately, of course, their defensive systems engaging to absorb or deflect the incoming fire, their countermeasures activating with the same mechanical efficiency they brought to everything. And then the missiles did something impossible. They changed course mid-flight, performing maneuvers that violated every principle of physics we understood, weaving through the dissolution's defensive fire with precision that could only indicate active guidance. But there were no energy signatures indicating remote control, no quantum entanglement links, no psychic pilots. Our analysts quickly determined the horrifying truth: each missile contained a human brain, or at least the electronic equivalent, a thinking, decision-making entity willing to guide itself into destruction for the tactical advantage of the whole. The humans had weaponized their own intelligence, creating ordnance that could adapt and react faster than any computer because it was not following a program but making choices. The Dissolution's adaptive defenses, designed to counter predictable attack patterns, suddenly faced thousands of independent actors each making unpredictable decisions, and for the first time since we had encountered these ancient destroyers, their efficiency dropped below perfect. 17 missiles penetrated their defenses. 17 nuclear detonations bloomed against Dissolution hulls, and while the damage was minimal, damage was not the point. The point was that damage had been inflicted at all. The human fleet did not celebrate their minor success or pause to assess. They pressed the attack with a ferocity that made our own desperate last stands look measured and cautious by comparison. Their larger vessels moved to engage directly, closing to ranges we considered suicidal, trading fire with Dissolution ships in brutal exchanges where both sides absorbed tremendous damage. But here was the difference: when a Council vessel was damaged, it retreated to preserve itself, following doctrine that prioritized survival over objective completion. When a human vessel was damaged, it accelerated harder, focusing all remaining power to weapons, becoming effectively a massive kinetic projectile with the added benefit of still being able to shoot. We watched in fascinated horror as a human destroyer, its hull breached in 17 locations, life support failing, propulsion damaged to the point where it could only move in one direction, pointed itself directly at a Dissolution cruiser and fired every weapon it possessed while simultaneously ramming at a significant fraction of light speed. The explosion was visible from our command station across millions of kilometers of space, and when the light faded, both vessels were gone. Captain Morrison's voice came through again, still impossibly calm despite the chaos of battle playing out on our sensors. He was coordinating his fleet with rapid-fire commands that our translators could barely keep pace with, directing ships to targets, calling out threats, ordering tactical adjustments with a speed that indicated either extensive cybernetic enhancement or a cognitive processing rate far higher than we had estimated for their species. High Commander Thexiol attempted to contact him, to offer what limited tactical support we could provide, to share our extensive data on Dissolution defensive patterns. Morrison acknowledged the transmission but politely declined the assistance, explaining in terms that were simultaneously respectful and dismissive that humanity had something the Council fleet had never possessed: experience fighting enemies that adapted to their tactics. He explained that human military history was essentially an arms race where each side continuously developed new methods of killing the other, that their entire strategic doctrine was based on the assumption that their enemy would learn and counter whatever worked yesterday, so they had become experts at innovation under pressure. He suggested we watch and learn, because humanity was about to share 10,000 years of accumulated warfighting knowledge with an enemy that had never faced an opponent willing to accept any cost, endure any sacrifice, or commit any atrocity if it meant achieving victory. The battle evolved into something our tactical computers could not properly model because the variables kept changing in ways that violated the algorithms. Humans employed tactics that were simultaneously brilliant and horrifying, using their own damaged vessels as bait, sacrificing smaller ships to position larger ones for optimal firing solutions, even deliberately allowing some vessels to be captured so they could detonate pre-planted explosives once inside Dissolution formations. They fought with a creativity born from desperation-made doctrine, where every limitation became an opportunity and every setback was simply data for the next attempt. Elder Counselor Miraveth observed quietly that we were watching a species that had evolved under the constant threat of extinction apply those survival instincts to warfare, and that perhaps the ancients had been right to fear them, just not for the reasons we assumed. They were not dangerous because they were cruel or malevolent. They were dangerous because they simply refused to accept that any fight was unwinnable, any enemy unbeatable, any sacrifice too great if it meant survival for one more day, one more hour, one more moment. The Dissolution began to react differently, their formations shifting in ways we had not seen in 43 prior engagements, their tactics evolving to counter the human approach. They started targeting the smaller human vessels first, attempting to eliminate the most maneuverable threats, adapting to the humans' adaptive tactics in a deadly spiral of escalation. But every time they adjusted, the humans adjusted faster, switching from one approach to another with a fluidity that suggested they had contingency plans for contingencies, backup strategies for failed backup strategies, all practiced and drilled until they were instinctive. We were watching two forces engaged in the most fundamental form of warfare, evolutionary pressure applied at the speed of combat, where the penalty for failing to adapt was not eventual extinction but immediate destruction. And for the first time in this war, the dissolution were not the only ones evolving. The difference was that humanity had been playing this game since they learned to throw rocks at predators, and they were very, very good at it. The battle had raged for 6 standard hours when the dissolution did something we had never seen in any previous engagement. They retreated. Not a tactical repositioning or a strategic withdrawal, but an actual retreat, pulling their forces back from contact with the human fleet to establish a new defensive formation. High Commander Thexiol's crystalline form flashed through colors so rapidly it created a visible spectrum, the physical manifestation of complete cognitive dissonance. In 43 engagements, across 17 fallen civilizations, the dissolution had never once withdrawn from battle. They advanced, they adapted, they overwhelmed, and they erased, but they did not retreat because retreat implied the possibility of defeat, and the dissolution had never faced anything that could defeat them. Until now. The human fleet had lost 23 vessels in the engagement, with another 16 so heavily damaged they could barely maintain formation, but they had destroyed or disabled 41 dissolution ships, a kill ratio that would have been considered miraculous if it were not bought with such devastating casualties. Captain Morrison's voice came through the communication channel, and for the first time there was no humor in his tone, only the flat exhaustion of someone who had been making life-and-death decisions for too long without rest. He reported his casualties with a brevity that suggested each number represented faces he knew, names he would remember, and a burden he would carry for whatever remained of his life. Then he requested permission to dock with our command station for repairs, resupply, and tactical consultation, acknowledging that his fleet had proven they could hurt the dissolution but not that they could defeat them. High Commander Thexiol granted permission immediately, sending coordinates for our repair facilities, such as they were, and assigned what remained of our engineering teams to assist. I found myself wondering what these humans would look like in person, whether they would appear as monstrous as their reputation suggested or as heroic as their actions implied, and whether there was truly any difference between those two concepts. The first transport docked 37 minutes later, and Captain Morrison emerged with 7 members of his senior staff. I had accessed every file we possessed on human physiology, reviewed the reports the ancients had compiled during their observations, but nothing had prepared me for the reality of their presence. They were bipedal, bilaterally symmetric, and fell within expected parameters for carbon-based life, but there was something in the way they moved, a predatory efficiency of motion that triggered instinctive fear responses in species that had evolved as prey. Morrison himself was unremarkable by their standards: average height, brown hair cropped short, eyes that were simultaneously tired and alert in a way that suggested extensive combat experience. He wore a uniform marked with symbols we did not recognize, and when he spoke, his voice carried an authority that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with having earned the respect of those he led through shared hardship. High Commander Thexiol greeted them in the council chamber, and the cultural exchange that followed was awkward in ways that transcended language barriers. We offered them hospitality according to our customs, which Morrison accepted with grace that suggested diplomatic training, though his crew maintained a tactical awareness of their surroundings that never fully relaxed. They were scanning for threats, evaluating defensive positions, cataloging potential exits, all while maintaining the appearance of casual conversation, and I realized that for humanity this was simply normal behavior, the baseline state of awareness they maintained because their evolution had punished inattention with death. Morrison reviewed the tactical data we provided on the dissolution's fleet composition, remaining forces, and likely reinforcement timeline. His analysis was rapid and thorough, identifying patterns we had missed and weaknesses we had not considered, asking questions that revealed a sophisticated understanding of fleet tactics and strategic planning. Then he asked a question that none of us had expected. He wanted to know why we had waited so long to call for help. High Commander Thexiol attempted to explain the quarantine, the warnings left by the ancients, the fear that had kept humanity isolated for 10,000 years. Morrison listened in silence, his expression unreadable, until Thexule finished speaking. Then the human did something remarkable. He laughed again, but this time the sound carried no humor, only a bitter recognition of irony that cut deeper than any weapon. He explained that humanity had detected the dissolution's advance months ago through their own deep space monitoring systems, that they had watched civilizations fall one by one, that they had debated internally whether to break the quarantine and offer assistance. But they had hesitated, uncertain whether the galactic community would accept help from the species that had been deemed too dangerous to join, afraid that their intervention would be interpreted as aggression or an attempt at conquest. Both sides had allowed pride and fear to delay cooperation, and 17 civilizations had died while humanity and the Council each waited for the other to make the first move. Elder Counselor Miraveth asked the question we were all thinking: why had humanity finally decided to respond? Morrison's answer was delivered with a simplicity that carried profound weight. He said that his species had a saying, "Never again." It was a phrase born from their own history, from times when they had failed to act against evil, when they had stood by while atrocities occurred, when they had chosen safety over morality and had paid the price in conscience and consequence. Humanity had sworn, repeatedly throughout their history, that they would not allow genocide to occur if they possessed the means to prevent it. The dissolution was executing the systematic extinction of sentient species, and regardless of past grievances or political considerations, humanity could not stand by and watch. It was not about strategy or gain or even survival. It was about the fundamental principle that some actions cannot be tolerated by any thinking being that wants to consider itself civilized. The humans had come not because we asked, though we had, but because to not come would be to betray their own values, their own identity, their own sense of what it meant to be human. The tactical planning session that followed revealed the depth of human military thinking in ways that both impressed and disturbed us. Morrison's staff included specialists in fields we had not considered relevant to warfare, psychologists who analyzed enemy behavior patterns, historians who drew parallels to ancient battles, even philosophers who helped frame strategic decisions in ethical contexts. They approached the problem of the dissolution not as a purely military challenge but as a multifaceted crisis requiring coordinated solutions. Their primary observation was that we had been fighting defensively, trying to preserve what remained rather than seeking to destroy the enemy, and while understandable given our losses, this approach guaranteed eventual defeat against a force that could not be outlasted or deterred. Humanity's proposed strategy was characteristically aggressive: identify the dissolution's command and control structures, launch a deep strike to decapitate their leadership, and disrupt their coordination sufficiently to turn their adaptive advantage against them. The plan was audacious to the point of insanity, requiring multiple fleets to coordinate across vast distances, relying on intelligence we did not possess about enemy systems we barely understood, and accepting casualty rates that we found morally unconscionable. Morrison acknowledged all of these concerns with a calm that suggested he had made similar calculations before. He explained that humanity's military doctrine accepted a fundamental truth: in warfare against a superior opponent, conventional tactics guarantee defeat, so the only path to victory requires accepting risks that appear suicidal to achieve effects that appear impossible. His species had spent 10,000 years fighting themselves, perfecting the art of warfare against an enemy that thought like them, adapted like them, and matched them in capability. The dissolution was powerful, ancient, and terrible, but they were not human, and that was their weakness. They could not understand a species whose response to overwhelming odds was not surrender but anger, whose reaction to impossible challenges was not despair but determination, whose instinct when facing extinction was not acceptance but defiance. We debated his proposal for 3 cycles, aware that each moment of discussion was a moment the dissolution used to regroup and reinforce. The council was divided, with some members arguing that humanity's aggressive approach would result in total annihilation of both our forces, while others contended that conventional methods had already proven completely ineffective and that any change to our approach at least offered some probability of a different outcome. It was not a vote of confidence in human tactics but a recognition that we had already exhausted every alternative. In the end, Elder Counselor Miraveth cast the deciding vote in favor of Morrison's plan, noting that the ancients had quarantined humanity not because they were evil or stupid but because they were effective, and that effectiveness was precisely what this situation demanded. We would entrust our survival to the species we had feared for 10 millennia, and we would discover together whether that fear had been wisdom or prejudice. Morrison and his staff worked with our remaining military commanders to coordinate the attack, sharing tactical data and strategic insights with a transparency that would have been unthinkable in pre-war politics. The humans brought weapons they had designed specifically for this engagement, having spent the journey from their system analyzing our data and developing countermeasures. They showed us munitions that exploited quantum uncertainty to become unpredictable, ships with hulls designed to absorb and disperse energy in ways that mimicked natural phenomena, even psychological warfare tactics intended to create errors in the dissolution's adaptive algorithms by presenting them with paradoxical situations. Every tool, every tactic, every strategy was designed around a single principle: make the enemy's strengths into weaknesses and accept any cost to achieve that goal. Watching them work, I began to understand why the ancients had been so afraid. Not because humanity was cruel or warlike, though they were both, but because they approached problem-solving with a relentless creativity that refused to accept any limitation as permanent or any rule as unbreakable. The combined fleet prepared to launch the offensive, with human vessels integrated throughout council formations in a way that would have been politically impossible before the war. We were no longer separate species pursuing independent goals but a unified force with a shared purpose: survival. Morrison delivered a final briefing to all personnel, broadcast across every ship in the fleet, human and otherwise. His words were translated into 47 languages for the benefit of our diverse crews, and I found myself moved by the universality of his message. He acknowledged that what we were attempting had never been done, that our chances of success were poor by any rational calculation, that many would not survive to see the outcome. But he also reminded us that history was filled with moments where rational calculations proved incomplete, where desperate circumstances produced impossible victories, where individuals facing certain death chose to fight anyway because surrender was simply not acceptable. Today, he said, we would learn whether the galaxy's most dangerous species and its most civilized could work together to face the galaxy's greatest threat. Today, we would teach the dissolution that some species refuse to be erased without a fight. The assault began in the dark space between systems, where the dissolution had established what our analysts believed was their regional command nexus. The human intelligence officers had identified it through methods they politely declined to fully explain, involving signal analysis, pattern recognition, and what one of them called educated guessing based on how we do it. The target was a massive construct, larger than anything we had built at the height of our civilization, surrounded by defensive platforms and patrol groups numbering in the hundreds. Morrison's plan called for a two-pronged assault. Council forces would engage the outer defenses in what appeared to be a conventional attack, drawing the dissolution's attention and adaptive focus, while human strike teams used that distraction to penetrate the inner perimeter and target the command structure directly. It was, High Commander Thexiol noted with resignation, essentially using our entire remaining fleet as bait while the humans attempted the actual objective. The engagement began precisely as planned, which meant it immediately deviated from the plan as soon as the dissolution responded. Council forces opened fire on the outer defense perimeter, and the dissolution adapted with the efficiency we had come to expect, repositioning their forces to counter our attack vectors and optimize their defensive fields. But this time we were not trying to win the engagement, merely survive it long enough to serve our purpose, and that fundamental shift in objective changed everything about our tactics. We fought not to destroy but to distract, not to advance but to maintain contact, accepting damage and casualties that would have triggered retreats in previous battles because retreat would compromise the mission. I monitored communications from 17 different ships as they reported critical damage, failing systems, casualties mounting, and in every case the commanders chose to maintain their positions, buying time with their lives for the humans to complete their part of the operation. The human strike force consisted of 37 vessels, relatively small by capital ship standards but equipped with stealth systems that made them nearly invisible to conventional sensors. They approached the command nexus from multiple vectors simultaneously, using the battle's chaos to mask their signatures and the Council fleet's engagement to occupy the Dissolution's attention. Captain Morrison commanded the lead ship, maintaining radio silence as his force penetrated deeper into enemy-controlled space, navigating through defensive fields that would have annihilated any vessel that attracted notice. I watched their progress through quantum-encrypted tactical feeds, my respiration rate increasing with each light second they advanced, knowing that discovery meant not just the failure of this mission but the loss of our last offensive capability and possibly our last hope. They reached the inner perimeter after 47 minutes of silent running, a journey that required navigating through defensive zones that shifted and adapted in real time, avoiding patrol groups that moved in patterns designed to maximize coverage while minimizing predictable routes. Then Morrison gave the order to break stealth and attack, and 37 human vessels opened fire simultaneously on the command nexus's core structure. The weapons they employed were unlike anything deployed in the opening battle, focused energy beams that induced cascading failures in the Dissolution's quantum-locked hulls, kinetic penetrators that carried payloads of exotic matter designed to disrupt their reality-anchoring systems, even informational warfare packages that attempted to corrupt their control algorithms with paradoxical data. The humans were not trying to destroy the structure through conventional damage but to introduce enough chaos into its systems that it could no longer coordinate the Dissolution fleet's adaptive responses. The Dissolution reacted with a fury we had not seen, pulling forces from the outer battle to defend their command center, suddenly treating the human strike force as the primary threat rather than an irritation to be dealt with after eliminating the Council fleet. High Commander Thexiol immediately recognized the opportunity and ordered all Council forces to press their attack, to exploit the Dissolution's divided attention and inflict maximum damage while their coordination was disrupted. The battle became a race. Could the humans destroy or disable the command nexus before the Dissolution's reinforcements overwhelmed them, and could the Council fleet survive long enough to support the withdrawal if the humans succeeded? Both questions carried the same answer, probably not, but we were committed now, past the point of retreat or reconsideration, forced to see this desperate gamble through to whatever conclusion awaited. Morrison's strike force fought with a ferocity that made the opening battle look restrained by comparison. They had positioned themselves in a sphere around the command nexus, directing fire inward from every angle, creating overlapping fields of fire that left no safe zone for defenders. The Dissolution attempted to adapt, to counter the multidirectional assault, but each adjustment to defend one vector left another temporarily vulnerable, and the humans exploited each opening with precision that suggested either prescient planning or real-time tactical analysis faster than our computers could achieve. Ships were destroyed, human casualties mounted with devastating speed, but the survivors pressed closer, accepting point-blank combat ranges where their weapons would be more effective but their defensive options non-existent. They were trading their ships' lives for incremental damage to the command structure, a calculus that was mathematically sound but emotionally devastating to witness. The command nexus began to fracture after 93 minutes of sustained assault, its quantum-locked structure showing the first signs of coherence failure. The Dissolution forces, apparently recognizing the threat, began to prioritize the Nexus's survival over all other objectives, pulling units from across the system to defend it. This meant abandoning their attacks on the Council fleet, which suddenly found itself facing significantly reduced opposition. High Commander Thexiol ordered an immediate advance, directing all remaining vessels to support the human strike force, turning the battle into a general engagement focused on a single objective. We abandoned defensive formations, ignored tactical best practices, and simply pushed forward with everything we had, because the humans had created an opportunity that might never come again, and to waste it would be to render their sacrifice meaningless. The battle reached a critical point when the command nexus's coherence finally failed completely, its structure collapsing in a cascade of exotic physics that our sensors struggled to interpret. The Dissolution fleet's coordination immediately degraded, ships that had moved with perfect synchronization suddenly operating independently, their adaptive responses becoming fractured and inconsistent. It was not a complete victory, they remained dangerous individually, but they had lost the collective intelligence that made them nearly unstoppable. Morrison's voice came through the communication channel, badly distorted by interference from the Nexus's collapse, reporting mission success but at catastrophic cost. Of the 37 vessels in his strike force, only 9 remained combat-capable, with 5 of those so heavily damaged they would require months of repair if they survived the next few minutes. He requested immediate extraction support, his calm finally breaking into something that sounded like exhaustion and pain and the weight of having just signed death warrants for hundreds of his people. The withdrawal was a fighting retreat through enemy forces that, while disorganized, still vastly outnumbered us and retained individual capabilities that matched or exceeded our vessels. Council ships formed a protective corridor for the surviving human strike force, absorbing fire meant for them, returning the sacrifice that had been made on our behalf. We lost 11 vessels during the withdrawal, including ships that had survived the entire war until this moment, their final acts being to shield allies they had met only days before. Elder Counselor Miraveth observed through the viewport as a Lumini dreadnought, one of the last 3 remaining from her species, positioned itself between a crippled human destroyer and pursuing dissolution forces, firing its weapons until the last moment before critical systems failed and the ship went dark. The destroyer survived. The dreadnought did not. We had become what we needed to be, not a collection of species pursuing survival, but a unified force willing to die for each other. The combined fleet regrouped at a rally point 3 systems away, counting our losses and treating our wounded. Of the human strike force, 9 ships had survived, but only 6 retained full operational capacity. Morrison's own vessel, the Indomitable, had sustained damage to its primary systems and was running on auxiliary power. The Council fleet had been reduced to 43 operational vessels from the 78 we had committed to the battle. By any conventional assessment, we had suffered a devastating tactical defeat. But strategically, everything had changed. The dissolution fleet was scattered across multiple systems, their coordination shattered, their adaptive advantage reduced to individual ship capabilities rather than collective intelligence. For the first time since this war began, we had seized the initiative. The aftermath of the battle brought a silence to the command station that felt heavier than any sound. We had survived, though survival felt like too generous a word for what remained. The council chamber, once grand and now merely functional, housed representatives from species that could be counted on one appendage. High Commander Thexiol stood before the tactical displays showing our scattered forces regrouping, his crystalline form cycling through colors that I had learned meant profound contemplation. Captain Morrison sat in a chair designed for a completely different physiology, looking exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness, the kind of weariness that came from making decisions that cost lives and living with the mathematics of acceptable loss. Elder Counselor Miraveth observed us both with eyes that had seen civilizations rise and fall, and I wondered what she saw in this moment, whether it was an ending or a beginning or simply another turn in the endless cycle of survival and extinction. Morrison broke the silence first, his voice carrying none of the humor from our initial contact, only the flat pragmatism of someone delivering a difficult truth. He explained that destroying the command nexus had bought us time, perhaps weeks or months depending on how quickly the dissolution could establish new coordination systems, but it was not victory. The enemy retained overwhelming numerical superiority and would eventually adapt to our tactics just as they had adapted to everything else. Our only advantage now was that we had proven they could be hurt, that their systems could be disrupted, and that unified action between species could achieve what isolated resistance could not. But maintaining that advantage required something the galaxy had never achieved, genuine cooperation between humanity and the galactic community, not as a temporary alliance born of desperation but as a permanent partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. The implications of his words settled over the chamber like radiation, invisible but transformative. What Morrison was proposing was nothing less than the complete restructuring of galactic civilization's foundational principles. For 10,000 years, the quarantine had been absolute, humanity kept isolated not through military force but through unanimous agreement that they were too dangerous to integrate. Now he was suggesting that not only should that quarantine end, but that humanity should be welcomed as equals, given access to our technology and knowledge, allowed to move freely among the stars. High Commander Thexiol voiced the concern we were all thinking. how could we be certain that humanity, once freed from their isolation, would not become a threat greater than the dissolution? How could we trust a species whose first response to every problem seemed to involve violence and whose history was written in the blood of their own people? Morrison's response was delivered without defensiveness or apology, simply stating facts that we could verify or reject as we chose. He acknowledged that humanity's history was violent, that their species had committed atrocities against themselves that would horrify most civilized species, that they possessed a capacity for cruelty that was matched only by their capacity for compassion. But he also pointed out that every species in the galaxy had evolved through competition and survival, that the only difference between humanity and the council races was that humans had been forced to compete against themselves because they were the only intelligent species on their world, while we had the luxury of directing our aggression outward against predators and rivals. Humanity's violence was not exceptional, merely concentrated and refined through 10,000 years of technological advancement without external threats to unite against. The quarantine had not made humanity safer for the galaxy, it had simply ensured they would remain perpetually focused inward, their competitive instincts directed at themselves rather than channeled toward common goals. Elder Counselor Miraveth asked the question that cut to the heart of the matter: what did humanity want? Not what they claimed to want, not the diplomatic answer designed to reassure us, but the genuine desire that drove their species, the motivation that would guide their actions once the immediate crisis passed. Morrison considered his answer carefully, and I respected him for not responding immediately with platitudes. He explained that humanity wanted what every intelligent species wanted: to survive, to grow, to explore, to leave some mark on the universe that said they had existed and mattered. But beyond those universal desires, humans wanted challenge. They wanted problems to solve, frontiers to push, limits to test. The quarantine had been torture for his species, not because it restricted their territory but because it restricted their potential, kept them confined to a single system when their nature demanded they reach for something beyond themselves. If the Council could provide that outlet, could offer humanity a place in something larger than themselves, could give them challenges worthy of their abilities, then the species the ancients feared could become the galaxy's greatest defenders. The debate that followed consumed 3 full cycles, with arguments that ranged from philosophical principles to tactical necessities, from historical precedents to projections of future scenarios. Some counselors argued that humanity's assistance in this crisis did not erase 10,000 years of justified caution, that gratitude should not overcome prudence. Others contended that the dissolution had already proven that the old order was obsolete, that species who clung to outdated fears while facing extinction deserved whatever fate awaited them. I listened to them all, these representatives of dying civilizations arguing about threats that might materialize while ignoring the threat that definitely would, and I realized that we had already made our choice the moment we sent that first transmission. We had broken the quarantine not when humanity arrived to help us, but when we decided that survival was worth any risk, any compromise, any partnership, no matter how dangerous. The vote, when it finally came, was not unanimous but it was decisive. The quarantine would be lifted, humanity would be welcomed into the galactic community as full members with all rights and responsibilities thereof, and a new military structure would be established combining human tactical doctrine with council resources and technology. There would be conditions, oversight, gradual integration rather than immediate full access, but the fundamental decision was made: we would face the future together or not at all. Morrison accepted the decision with a nod that suggested he had expected nothing less, though I detected relief in his expression that indicated he had not been entirely certain of the outcome. He promised that humanity would prove worthy of the trust being placed in them, that they would fight to defend not just themselves but all species of the galaxy, and that perhaps together we would demonstrate that intelligence and cooperation could triumph over entropy and extinction. The war continued, of course, because the dissolution did not negotiate or surrender, they simply continued their programmed purpose until stopped by force. But now we fought differently, with human vessels integrated into every fleet, human officers training council crews in aggressive tactics, human engineers adapting our technology in ways that violated established principles but produced undeniable results. We learned from them, and they learned from us, and slowly the tide began to turn not toward victory but toward something more valuable: hope. The dissolution remained dangerous, remained numerous, remained implacable, but they no longer seemed unstoppable. Each battle brought new innovations, new tactics, new examples of what different species working together could achieve. We lost ships and personnel, suffered defeats and setbacks, mourned the fallen and honored their sacrifice, but we no longer fought with the certainty of eventual extinction. 6 months after that first desperate transmission, I stood again in the command station's observation deck, watching a joint Human Council fleet prepare for deployment. Captain Morrison had been promoted to admiral, commanding a battle group that included vessels from 12 different species, all working in coordination that would have been unthinkable before the war. He had kept his promise, proving through actions rather than words that humanity could be trusted with the responsibility they had claimed. The fleet launched toward a dissolution stronghold, their formation a mixture of human aggression and council discipline, ready to face whatever awaited them with confidence born not from certainty of victory but from certainty of purpose. I thought about the message we had sent in our darkest hour, the desperate gamble that had changed everything, and wondered if perhaps the ancients had been wrong about humanity, or perhaps they had been right but had drawn the wrong conclusion. Elder Counselor Miraveth joined me at the viewport, her ancient eyes tracking the departing fleet. She spoke quietly, almost to herself, noting that in 10,000 years of recorded history, the galaxy had never faced a threat like the dissolution, had never been forced to question its fundamental assumptions about safety and isolation and the nature of danger. Perhaps it required this crisis to reveal that the most dangerous species in the galaxy was not the one we should fear but the one we should embrace, because when extinction came calling, we needed defenders who understood that survival sometimes required accepting any cost, enduring any sacrifice, and fighting with a ferocity that civilized species had forgotten how to summon. Humanity had not saved us from the dissolution, at least not yet, but they had saved us from something worse, the slow death of accepting defeat, the quiet extinction of surrendering to inevitability, the final darkness of losing hope that anything could change. The fleet disappeared into the quantum foam, beginning another journey toward another battle in a war that might last decades or centuries. But we would face it together now, human and council, dangerous and civilized, united by necessity and forged by adversity into something neither could have become alone. The transmission we sent that desperate day had called for help from the most dangerous species we knew. What arrived was not a weapon or a monster or a savior, but something more valuable, partners who refused to let us die without a fight, allies who understood that some battles must be fought regardless of the odds, and friends who proved that danger and honor were not opposites but different aspects of the same fierce commitment to survival. We had made our final call with no hope left, and in answering, humanity had given us something we thought we had lost forever, a reason to believe tomorrow might come, and that we might live to see it.